The rain fell on Kensington in the way that only London rain could fall, not with any particular violence, but with a kind of patient, inevitable persistence, as if the clouds had all the time in the world and nowhere better to be. Lieutenant Columbo stood at the window of his flat on Lexham Gardens, watching the droplets trace their paths down the glass, and he thought, not for the first time that morning, that he might make himself another cup of coffee. 15 years. 15 years since he'd hung up his badge at the LAPD, since he'd decided that the puzzle-solving life had taken enough from him. He'd come to London almost by accident, a vacation that had stretched into a sabbatical and then into something more permanent. The flat was small, comfortable, filled with books and jazz records. He knew the man at the corner shop. He took his tea at the same cafe on Kensington High Street most afternoons. It was, by any reasonable measure, a good life, a quiet life. The telephone rang at 9:30. Columbo considered not answering it. He'd learned over the years that telephones often brought complications. But curiosity, that old familiar itch, made him reach for the receiver. The voice on the other end was clipped, official, thoroughly British. Detective Inspector James Whitmore from Scotland Yard. There'd been a murder. An art dealer, prominent man, found in his gallery in Mayfair with a knife between his shoulder blades. The case was proving difficult. There were complications. And Whitmore, somewhat reluctantly, had been informed that the American detective living quietly in Kensington might be persuaded to take a look. Columbo listened without speaking, letting the rain continue its work against the window. No, he said finally. No, he didn't think so. That life was behind him now. He was retired. He appreciated the thought, truly, but Scotland Yard had capable people. Surely they could manage without an old American in a raincoat. Whitmore had tried again, with increasing frustration. The victim was named Gregory Ashford, wealthy, connected. The case was becoming political. They needed someone who could see clearly, someone from outside the usual machinery. Still no, Columbo had said, though something in the way Whitmore described the scene, the positioning of the body, the apparent lack of motive, the sense that nothing quite added up, had stirred something in him. He'd thanked the inspector politely and hung up the telephone. He made that coffee he'd been thinking about. He sat down with the morning paper. He tried very hard not to think about Gregory Ashford lying dead in his Mayfair gallery, or about the questions that the inspector hadn't quite been able to answer. By noon, he was putting on his raincoat, the old one, worn and rumpled, that had travelled with him from California to London and seemed unlikely to ever travel anywhere else. He found his car keys. He looked at himself in the mirror, tired eyes, rumpled hair, the expression of a man about to do something he'd promised himself he wouldn't do. Then he went out into the rain and toward a murder that he couldn't quite leave alone. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten worse, turning the London streets into rivers of reflected neon and broken promises. Columbo drove with one hand, the other wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee he'd picked up somewhere between Scotland Yard and the first interview of the morning. He never remembered where the coffee came from. That was part of the charm, or so he'd been told. Margaret Ashford lived in Chelsea, in one of those tall Victorian townhouses that probably cost more than Columbo made in 5 years. Her ex-husband's money, of course. That's what the lieutenant had learned from his preliminary notes. 23 years married to Victor Ashford before she'd had enough of his collecting obsession and his wandering eye. The divorce settlement had been generous. Some said too generous. Some said Margaret had earned every penny by staying as long as she had. She answered the door in a cream-coloured sweater and dark slacks, her silver hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd been expecting him. She had. His reputation preceded him, apparently, even across the Atlantic. "Lieutenant Columbo," she said, stepping aside. "Do come in. You'll catch your death in that coat." They settled in a sitting room that smelled of expensive flowers and old money. Margaret offered tea. Columbo accepted, then forgot to drink it. He had questions about Victor's movements on the night of the murder. Margaret remembered them clearly. Victor had been home until 7 o'clock. Then he'd gone out to meet with his business partner, Edmund Harcourt. They were planning something, Margaret said. Something about authentication. She didn't know the details. Victor never told her the details anymore. That was interesting. Columbo asked about the debts. Margaret's jaw tightened just slightly. Victor had debts, yes. Substantial ones. The art world could be expensive, especially if you had expensive tastes and not quite enough money to support them. She had wondered about it herself toward the end. Toward the end. Columbo wrote that down. He drove next to Edmund Harcourt's gallery in Mayfair, a sleek glass and steel affair that made Columbo's head hurt just looking at it. Harcourt was younger than Victor, mid-50s, with the kind of tan that suggested regular holidays somewhere warm. He confirmed the meeting. Yes, they'd discussed authentication procedures. Yes, they'd been developing a new system. No, nothing irregular about it. Columbo asked about the forged pieces. Harcourt's face went very still. What forged pieces? There were no forged pieces. Victor would never. Columbo didn't argue. He just wrote in his notebook and asked if Harcourt knew a man named Castellano, a collector from Milan. Harcourt said no. Too quickly, perhaps. By evening, Columbo had spoken to 3 people and heard 3 versions of the truth. One of them was a lie. Maybe 2. Maybe all 3. He sat in his hotel room with the rain still falling outside, turning the city into something grey and indistinct, and he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was missing something obvious, something that had been right there in front of him all along. He stared at his notebook and waited for the answer to arrive. Ha! And then, just after midnight, it came to him. Columbo sat upright in the darkness of his hotel room, the answer arriving not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of a door clicking shut. He reached for the phone before he could second-guess himself. The desk clerk at the Ashford Gallery sounded thoroughly annoyed at being rung at such an hour, but Columbo was already past the pleasantries. "I need to know about the security cameras," he said. "The ones in the back corridor. Were they operational the night of Mr. Ashford's death?" There was a pause, then a hesitant yes. By 7 in the morning, Columbo was back at the gallery with a warrant and a cup of terrible coffee that he'd bought from a street vendor near Piccadilly. The manager, a nervous man named Davies, led him to the security office with the reluctance of someone walking toward his own execution. The footage was grainy, shot in that peculiar nighttime green that security cameras favor, but it was clear enough. At 11:47 p.m., someone had entered the back corridor. Not the dealer, not the wife, not the rival collector. It was Marcus Webb, Ashford's trusted assistant of 12 years, and in his hands he carried a small bronze statue, the same statue that would, 3 minutes later, be used to cave in the back of Richard Ashford's skull. Columbo watched the footage twice. Then he asked Davies to pull up the files on the gallery's insurance claims. Within an hour, he had what he needed. Forged documents, phantom sales, a carefully constructed scheme spanning 5 years, one that would have come to light during the audit that Ashford had scheduled for the following week. When Columbo found Webb, the man was already packing. A suitcase lay open on his bed in a modest flat in Whitechapel, half filled with clothes and what looked like most of his life savings in various currencies. "It was going to destroy me," Webb said quietly, not bothering to deny anything. "Everything I'd built, my reputation, my career. He was going to hand me over to the police. I panicked. I couldn't let that happen." Columbo listened without interrupting. He'd learned long ago that sometimes people needed to explain themselves, to make sense of the senseless. It didn't change anything. It never did. But it mattered to them, and that mattered to him. The confession took 40 minutes. Webb was calm about it, almost relieved. The weight of the secret had been heavier than the weight of the crime. Later that evening, back in his flat, with its view of the rain-slicked London streets, Columbo poured himself a whiskey and sat by the window. The case was closed. Justice would take its course. But already his mind was beginning to wander to the next mystery, the next puzzle waiting somewhere out there in this vast, complicated city. He wondered what it would be.